Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Foster Swift's What Employers Need to Know for 2022 webinar. We appreciate you joining us this morning. We have a very informative session and we'll keep the introductions quite short. The other thing I'd like to remind you is today's session is general information only, and we do encourage you to always check with your legal counsel prior to taking any action so that you know specifically how the law applies to your particular situation.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID hygiene, everybody. I know people are probably tired of talking about COVID at this point in time, but unfortunately, it's something we're going to have to deal with into 2022. So the number one thing we need to do is get on top of what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to keep places clean, how we're supposed to act in the workplace, because if we want to reopen the workplaces, we're going to continue to have to follow rules, some guidelines, and just simply have some basics down so that we don't get ourselves in a position where you have my OSHA coming in and getting us in trouble, getting some fines and citations. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we know COVID is real and that we know we have problems with COVID and that we're going to have to continue to deal with it. So obviously one of the things that we're dealing with right now is we've got the shot, right? We've got the vaccine. And so, Kim, if you can go to the next slide. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the vaccines, but if everybody was watching today, there's been a real big development in some of the vaccine issues, and that was in the state of Washington. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about mandates and requirements and what your options are, but it's really a telling one today. So Washington State made a rule, and the Washington State rule was that all state employees have to be vaccinated. And yesterday was the day that they had to be vaccinated by or have an exception. Well, the coach of Washington State's football team had said, I'm not taking it before. Then he said, well, I'll comply. And then he kept kind of hedging his bets. And then finally, last night, he was fired. And he was fired because he didn't take the vaccine. Now, he had put in for a religious exception. But evidently it was denied, and he's fired. And if you know anything about college sports, the interesting fact is, generally speaking, in a lot of states, in the majority of states, the highest paid state employee of almost every state is the football coach or the basketball coach. They're usually the highest paid. So it's a pretty big deal when they get let go. So not only was he let go, but also 3 of his assistants also were let go too. So it's a big deal right now. It's continued to be topical. So we have to look at all these different rules, and we're going to get to that in a second, but just this stuff is happening in workplaces all over the country. It's not going away, and the vaccines are really leading the way because the government's putting that campaign together to say, get up your sleeves, we want to get that, but we're sort of stuck. A little bit over half of Americans are vaccinated, and workforces can go anywhere from 10% up to 99% vaccination rates. But going into 2022, I don't see that the vaccine issues are going to go away, because part of keeping a workplace clean and hygienic, according to most of the sources, is the vaccines are a way to do that. So we're going to continue to see this issue come up. We're going to see it pressed. We're going to see different pressure points. It may be from the state. It may be from the federal government. It may be from the county. It may be from your own employer. So just something to keep in mind that this doesn't go away. So Kim, if you can go to the next slide. So the big thing that we ask is, and this comes up all the time, and I think most people know this, but it's good to go over it because these are the 3 big questions. Can you ask someone if they've been vaccinated, one of your employees? Absolutely. Yes, you can. You can ask that question. Can you get a copy of the vaccination record? Absolutely. You can ask for it. Okay. And can employees be fired? I just told you they can, but there are exemptions and there are policy issues. So let's go back to the first one. Can you ask? Yes. You got to be very careful on how you ask. What you can't do is this. Hey, you've been vaccinated? Why not? Oh, yeah? Well, what's your medical reason? And all of a sudden you start getting into all these issues and all these questions of people. You want to say point blank, put a policy together, have a process by which you ask people whether or not they're vaccinated. That's very benign. And then if the person says no, you need to have an exemption policy. That way, those who are not vaccinated if you need to apply a vaccination policy, if you're going to have a mandatory policy, you allow individuals who you want to wear a mask, or you want to have testing, or you want something else to happen so that you can make sure your workplace is safe. You have to have that process second. Okay, so they have a medical reason, they have a religious reason. Those are the two reasons why you wouldn't do it. And as far as getting a copy, you can't just leave it on a desk and just walk out and let everybody walk by it. You've got to protect that information. While you are allowed to ask, you do have to protect it like it's any other medical document. So keep it safe, keep it segregated, and keep it away from other people. One of the things that comes up with the vaccines that's very important is these exemptions. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. But really, you can do whatever you want as long as you're not mandated. You have your own policy as far as, you know, how broad you want it to be and things of that nature, but you cannot discriminate against people. So if you let some people get away, well, that's Johnny or that's Susie, we want them to have the, you know, don't have to have the vaccine because their mom owns part of the company. Fine, but when a person says that they want a medical exemption and you shut the door and say no, you could have yourself a problem, because they can say you let other people have exemptions, but not me, and I've got a medical exemption. So be very careful. Or you could have an age or a race or other protected classification issue. So you need to develop a policy. If you want to mandate vaccines in your workplace, you can. You can do it. And you can go through the process. You can ask people. You can get their information. You can ask for an exemption. And then you've got to look at it. Now, the exemptions for a medical reason are basically the same that you would do for any type of ADA accommodation that you would have. You would go through whether or not it's an unreasonable, undue hardship on the employer. Another thing that you should look at is the EEOC actually has guidance on this, an FAQ standard. And so it goes to a lot of questions that are asked about vaccines, and it talks about, can you ask certain questions? And it actually goes through it. So I strongly recommend you go to the EEOC, the federal government agency that oversees discrimination, and you can take a look. And they have very good FAQs in certain situations of what you can and can't do. It'll say, what am I supposed to do if a person wants an accommodation? Well, it'll actually say, if a person needs an accommodation, the first thing you shouldn't do is kick them out, make them work remote. You should first try to see, if you're going to work in person, whether or not that individual can work with some PPE. Does that, in your workplace, is that going to allow you to be able to let them work reasonably? So it's very important, and they update those all the time. So the bottom line is, you're supposed to work with people to keep them in, and if you can't keep them in the workplace, then you might be able to remove them. And if you can't remove them because you don't have the ability to do that, that's when you may have to terminate them. So there's a process. And before you ever fire anybody under the vaccines, you have to make sure your process is right. So you work tight, you work with your managers, you look at your job descriptions, you look at what you do. Are we interfacing with the public? Do we have people walking all over the place? How are we doing this? How are we keeping our workplace clean and safe? And so that's all part of the hygiene, but it's all part of the process. So Kim, if you go to the next slide. There are right now 3 vaccine rules coming down the road based on executive orders. So the way we look at how to keep your workplace clean, again, we'll talk about a little bit of the OSHA guidance on this, but vaccines are part of that process. As an individual employer, you can make your own rules. You can say, we are requiring people to be vaccinated. You could say, we're not. It's up to you. Unless you fall under one of these 3 vaccine rules, which are going to be significant. In fact, one of them is going to cover an estimated 80 million employees in the country. And they're pretty big, and they're coming from the top, and they all came out right around September 9th. So now we're looking at, okay, how do these apply, and what do I need to do to get ready? And you've heard about a lot of these in news, but there are a lot of details. We had hoped that we would have more detail by now, but they've essentially drugged their feet on 2 of them. So we don't have all the information we wish we had. We thought by now we would have had the rules, but they're just not here yet. But let's talk a little bit about the clear guidance that we have from the federal government. And Kim, can you go to the next slide for me real quick? I mean, this is very simple. Like everything COVID, I mean, we got real direction here that's helping us out. It's putting us right on the right path. As you know, all the guidances about how to quarantine and you know, who you got to pay and when you've got to pay, that stuff's been crystal clear. And this is just as crystal clear. I mean, it's just like that roadmap is right there. And Kim, if you can go to the next slide. What we know right now is that they're going to go for federal contractors, nursing homes, and most Medicare and Medicaid recipients, employers, right? And employers with over 100 employees. Now, the federal contractor vaccine mandate is up and running. The nursing home and most Medicaid, Medicare recipients, that's in the works. Anytime it could be released, the rules and how it's going to happen. And employers with over 100 people, it's been tentatively drafted, sent over from OSHA over to the folks at the OMB for their final review, and should be released any day now. Should be coming out anytime. If you go to the next slide, Kim, we want to talk a little bit about the federal contractors. So they're different. All these are different. So it depends on who you are. So the first question is, you better get a vaccine if you're a federal contractor, because there's an executive order from President Biden issued on my birthday. Happy birthday. Safer Federal Workforce Task Force issued rules. Now, this is a group that's tasked with actually making the rules, enforcing the rules. And I put the links in here because it's really important. If you don't know if you're covered, if you don't know what you're supposed to do, what we've got here is both the notice they put out, that's the first link, and then the second link is actually going to an FAQ, which is, again, actually helpful, goes through some of the requirements that you're supposed to have. An interesting part about the federal contractor vaccine mandate is that it does not have what you've heard about, the testing option. Get vaccinated, period. All federal contractors have to be vaccinated, period. End of story. So you don't have the ability to weekly test people out of this. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, because you may have 10, 50, 30, 60% of your employees that are vaccinated, and you can't make those other people get a vaccination. You can't put them in a headlock and get them a vaccine. So what are you supposed to do with it? So it's a very important issue. If you go to the next slide, Kim, you'll see that there's a question about who is a federal contractor, because this is one of the biggest questions that we have. And if you go to the next slide, Kim, you'll see that federal contractors is somewhat defined on what it is. They have the applicability of who is and isn't a federal contractor. But the reality is you need to look here, and you also need to look at those slides that I just gave you, because they've exempted some people, they've made some people in, some people out. But before you decide whether you're in or out, you need to really take a real quick look, right? Take a very quick look to make sure you're in or out. If you just get a federal grant, that's not going to make you a federal contractor. And there are certain types of federal contracts that are too small to actually fall under this vaccine mandate. So it's a case-by-case situation. You only know based on your particular situations. But it's a ton of employers, and the goal is to try to get more people. The goal is to try to make more people be covered by the vaccine mandate. So that's what the federal government wants to do. They want to make you do it, and they want you to start going now. Because what they want is everybody by December the 8th that's a federal contractor to be vaccinated, which means you got to start getting needles in your arms today if you're going to be fully vaccinated with 2 shots and the 2-week waiting period. So if you've waited and you don't know, today or tomorrow might be the right day to start figuring out whether you're covered by this. Because if you lose or get debarred, you're going to have a problem. And of course, there's some questions about existing contracts and all new contracts. It's going to be part of all the new contracts that are coming out from the federal government to be covered. So, and it's not just, and it's a very interesting rule, because you have to make sure, let's say you have a person who works out at a remote site doing work over there for the federal contract, but then they come back to your main office. If that person is going to come in contact with other people while they're back at the main office, then you got to get everybody else vaccinated that's going to come in contact with them. So you got subcontractors, there's rules about them as well. And your requirement to make sure that they are also complying with the vaccine mandate. So it's a very broad and a very assertive vaccine mandate without the right to do it. Now, it does specifically allow for exemptions, and the exemptions could be for a medical exemption or for a religious exemption. And we need to, it's a different story than say the state or the city of New York, which actually has a court case right now because they did not allow for religious exemptions. And the case obviously is that's discrimination and it's a federal violation because if you're going to allow for medical, you have to allow for religious exemptions, which is what the EEOC has said consistently, but the state says no, there's a good reason. And the standard for what you are allowed to give for a medical exemption is different as far as that burden under the ADA than what you have to give for a religious exemption. Religious exemption doesn't have quite as broad of a protection as somebody who needs a medical exemption. On the other hand, if you look at the guidance that's out there, there's very few things that are allowed to have a medical exemption. So for instance, a hospital locally, there's been reports about that. They had 400 people that quit because they didn't want to take the vaccine because the hospital they worked for was requiring it. But that was a real small drop in the bucket of their massive tens of thousands of employees. And they indicated only 1% essentially is what I understand of employees didn't want to work, but 6% of the employees actually received an exemption. And most of those exemptions were for religious reasons and not medical reasons. And so there, for instance, somebody might come forward and say, I need an exemption because I've had a severe allergic reaction in the past to a vaccine. And so your doctor, your healthcare provider might say, and I'm strongly recommending they not take it. So then what do? Well, then you've still got to take, though you can't just let the person come in. Nope, you got to make sure that person is safe. You got to make sure that they're wearing masks. You got to make sure they're social distancing and doing all those things. So that's part of this rule. It's very important to know that it's different than the other rules, and it's going to have its own regulations on how to apply it. So just be careful, know whether you're a federal contractor or not. Kim, can you go to the next slide? So the next slide I was going to go over is the nursing home and the Medicaid and Medicare recipients. So that vaccine's coming out of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So, and I guess that's right there. That's the covered contractors. Again, I talked about December 8th and the individuals covered. But what we need to talk about here is the next vaccine. And CMS is putting out those rules right now. So the president puts out a vaccine mandate, and he originally said all nursing homes. And then he said, well, wait a minute. We need to make it bigger than just nursing homes. And he did. And so they sort of expanded who's going to be covered. And we don't really know 100% who it's going to be, but it's going to be nursing home workers, dialysis facilities, hospitals, ambulatory surgical settings, healthcare agencies, and more. And pretty much anybody who's getting Medicare and Medicaid programs. So beware if you fall in there. And you may fall in, you may fall out. We don't have, unfortunately, we thought we'd have it by now, the final rules on this. But it'll probably have a ramp up time. And how they're going to work this is they're going to come out with an emergency technical standard. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And they'll put some kind of guidance out there. They're not going to have a lot of public opinion. It's just going to go effective under emergency rules and under the president's plan. I'm sure there's going to be challenges to this in all three of these in courts, but it's going to be difficult. Depending on the language, it's why they're taking their time. Lobbyists obviously are looking at this. Now, this particular rule here itself, it may or may not have a testing option. We don't know. We don't think it's going to have one, but we don't know. And the reason why it may put one in there at the end of the day is just, reality. How do you have enough people if you have 30% of your healthcare workers that are covered who say, I'm not taking the vaccine, and you don't have a testing option? Can you replace them? Can you actually provide medical care? We don't know. So I can't get into a whole lot of details here because we don't have it, other than know if you're in these areas and you think you may be covered, it might be a good time to start asking for proof of vaccination. It might be a good time to see how you're going to provide care. Can you get it through the staff that you have, or do you need to start, I know you're probably already looking for staff, but can you start going out and recruiting in a different way? So Kim, if you can go to the next slide, please. Now, employers with 100 plus employees is the big one that's going to cover the most employees of all these, really, that and the federal contractor. And we're getting real close that we talked about. Details are not there, But what we do know that's different than the other two most likely is that testing is going to be part and parcel of it. We don't know who's going to pay for the testing. We don't know how it's going to be paid for. So we have to watch that very carefully. But the bottom line is if you've got 100 employees, and it's most likely going to be the same way that we add up 100 employees for FMLA, or it might just be 100 employees total wherever you work. We just don't have those details. But the long story short is if you think you have 100 plus employees, you better watch out. You're going to have a vaccine mandate. So again, how do you get ready for this? Well, start drafting a policy. Find out what departments you might have vulnerabilities in. Find out, okay, I'm good in accounting, but I'm not good over here. If you have a production facility, how many employees do I have that are vaccinated? How many employees do I need to get tested? How am I going to work with that? I'm sure some of you have already been getting these emails from companies saying, hey, we can come on out and do the testing for you. Don't sign a contract till you know exactly what the testing has to be, because we don't know what type of testing we're going to have quite yet. So let's be careful, but also line up some opportunities to get yourself in a position so you can be successful. So we can go to the next slide, Kim. So what are you doing? All right, so we've got these vaccine mandates. They're all over the place and sky is falling. You know, we can't get people, you know, obviously we've got a lot of places that have worker shortages. They're having a heck of a time getting people in the first place. And so the question is, what do I do? Well, the first thing you got to do is don't panic, even though I've got a third, but that's the most important thing. Don't panic. Don't get too upset. You can expect that the vaccines and the mandates are going to be there. You can also expect that we're going to continue to get an update on what we've got to do. So you got to get 2 shots a day. And I bet you we're going to probably define this thing as you have to get a booster shot eventually, right? So just understand it's going to be a moving target, just like everything else that's been COVID since the beginning, because we're going to continue to evolve with how the rules, the regulations, and the studies all come out. We're probably going to have some changes and some amendments to the executive orders because we're going to have people lobbying saying, hey, this is working. This part's kind of a struggle. Can we work with this? Can we work with that? Because ultimately, you've got to get products made. You've got to get services provided, and you got to have employees to get it done. And you can't just have unworkable rules. And I think that's what they'll understand. But from your perspective, it makes sense to start asking people whether or not they've been vaccinated so you know where your holes are. Because even if you're less than 100 employees and you're not a federal contractor and you don't do Medicare or Medicaid, the question is, will the state enact one like Washington State did? Will some city you work in enact it? So we just don't know that. But what you do know is you can prepare. And you can have protections and you can have a policy. And even if you don't have a policy for vaccines, you can prepare just in case you are mandated to do so. These are very simple, easy ways to handle this matter. And again, the testing issues, you know, that's something you can do even if you are sitting out there without a mandate on anyway. So it's just about a part of the way we have to look at business going forward is we have to understand it's an evolving situation. At one point in time, probably 10 months ago, everybody was thinking, okay, we'll get past COVID, we'll get everybody vaccinated, we're going to get out of the pandemic stage, we're going to go back to old rules. It's not really happening. We're going to continue to have to deal with this for quite some time, and I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. So I don't think that's a legitimate way to prepare. To just simply say, we'll be out of this soon, it's just not the way it's being. You're going to have to deal with mandates. You're going to have to look at whether you fall in the cracks. And you're going to have to review your policies and your procedures. If you want people to work in person, that's great, but it's very important to note the federal contractor requirement doesn't exempt people who work remote. Think about that for a minute. Right now, if I'm a remote employee, I never come in contact with anybody. I stay in my house. I'm fully masked up all day in my house alone, and I work for you. What reasonable relationship would making me get a vaccine to continue my employment have to my job? I'm not harming anybody. I don't pose a direct threat. So under your normal traditional look at the Americans with Disability Act, to put a vaccine mandate on me when I don't come in contact with people may not and probably would not meet the normal requirements for a work-related and necessary protection. So if you fired a remote worker who never came into the office, who hasn't come in the office and has no expectation of coming into the office, that might be a violation because you're requiring that type of mandate on a person who doesn't have a work-related context. The federal vaccine mandate says it doesn't matter if you work remote. You're under this thing and you have to have the vaccine or have an exemption. That's it. It's that simple. So again, the testing mandate kind of takes that out of the 100+ employees. We don't know about the medical one, but it's something to think about as you go through. If you're doing your own procedure, you have to make sure it's necessary. You have to find out if you can fall through the cracks, can you have people working remote? If you don't want people working remote, you need to start bringing them back in and you need to start explaining why. Obviously, your own policies are going to have to cover the gamut of all these different issues. What do you want? Draft a policy that makes sense, follow the EEOC's guidance, the Americans with Disability Act, and you have to look at people's exemptions and you have to do a due diligence and a case-by-case analysis of what your job is, what it's supposed to be. But some of these federal guidances and some of the state ones that if they come out could be much, much more aggressive than what you could do personally. Now, there is an example of a place that got really out there. We had a hospital that went out and did a vaccine mandate. People put in religious exemptions and said, I can't do this because of my religious belief. And it's because of the use of stem cells from an aborted fetus and that line in the testing or in the development of the vaccines. And so the hospital came back and said, oh, okay, well then just sign this attestation that you're not going to take Tylenol or Pepto-Bismol or any of these other drugs that were tested the same way. Then they push back. Now the question is, how hard do you want to push back? Because if you don't give somebody an exemption that is otherwise qualified, then that person could bring a lawsuit saying you violated the ADA because they have a medical condition or because they have a religious qualification. And people are saying, well, what do you do? There's never been cases like this. Well, there actually are. There's tons of cases out there. They're all on flu shots. For years and years and years, a lot of employers have mandated flu shots, and the issue of whether or not the person does or doesn't have a real religious reason or a medical exemption has been tested over and over and over again. And there's lots of court cases, and they're very, very fine on the details. And so each one has to be looked at because sometimes they'll say, that's not really a religious exemption. That's not legitimate. That's just something you just made up. And there are factors you look at. And so you have to look at it. Without getting into it, I would strongly recommend you talk to counsel about it before you say no, because it can turn on one or two simple facts. And again, it's a business decision when you make these decisions, but it's also a legal decision. It depends on how hard you want to push back and what you're going to do. And if you're a federal contractor, it might mean, well, would I rather lose this contract or continue to maybe have a lawsuit? So you just have to watch out. It's a very, very difficult predicament to put employers in, to be frank with you. And Kim, can you go to the next slide, please? So we talked a little bit about COVID. Obviously, COVID is always going on. There's all these rules, all these technicalities. But the bottom line is some of the easiest stuff that we've got to do that people are forgetting about is house cleaning, just keeping clean. How do we keep workplaces clean? How do we keep people safe? And, last year, I think we're doing a great job being like surgeons out there. We were washing our hands like there's no tomorrow. Everybody was clean. Nobody's touching doorknobs. Everybody's keeping away. And now everybody's touching doorknobs because they're vaccinated and they're coughing all over the place and nobody cares. That's a big mistake. I see a lot of places making the biggest mistake is we learned a lot of good lessons about how to keep people healthy and coming back to work. Let's keep places clean. Let's just do those simple things to make sure that everything is healthy, because even if you've got a COVID shot, you can still get a virus. You can still get a bug. Those happen. People are sick all the time. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things you want to do is you want to make sure you're doing it the right way. So go to the CDC and the local guidance. They'll tell you exactly what we should be doing about cleaning. They'll tell you how to clean things. One of the greatest things that the CDC said early on was crack a window and get some sunlight. Sometimes sunlight will kill viruses. Get ventilation. Make sure your HVA system is up and running. Make sure it's on the specs. Make sure standards are all met. Make sure you're cleaning surfaces regularly. Try not to have pens and things like that shared by people. Get some no-touch devices if you've got it. If you're going to have donuts and things like that, you might not want to have people grabbing into the same box. Maybe have them individual, but just little things like that. I know people want to fist fight over no coffee. That's a hard one for me to get to, but you got to think about, how do we want to do coffee? Do we want people congregating around all the time? So just think about these little things that can stop the communal nature of everybody being really close and touching the same devices if they're not going to be cleaning their hands the way they used to. If you don't have mask mandates, if you don't have things like that, remember, you're still going to have other things besides COVID that can go around. They can cause people to, have symptoms like COVID, and that could be a problem because then you lose some of the workforce, right? So look at the CDC's guidance. I've got some links. You can go to these. They're very simple, but they're common sense things that you should be up to. Filter, open the air, clean, update your policies, contact your local health department, look at your, just all the different localities you operate in, and they have some great ideas for you. Now, this is the important thing to keep in mind. OSHA and MyOSHA. OSHA's federal. They oversee federal guidance. Almost everybody in the country is run by OSHA, but not us here in Michigan. We opted out and have our own Michigan OSHA, and it's got to be as strict or stricter than everybody else. And OSHA's come out with some guidance on what you're supposed to do for masks and for cleanliness in the workplace. Healthcare has its own mandatory requirement. They issued from OSHA an emergency technical standard, which means it's very important and it's immediate. And it talks about who's got to wear a mask and where, and social distancing. And it talks about every area of your building. We're not going to get into details on that, but if you are in the healthcare sector, this has been in place for a long time. If you provide healthcare of any type, you should go to OSHA's website, make sure that you're in compliance. It's somewhat technical because you have to give out certain types of face masks, and you have to have people wearing those, not just simply cloth fabric, mask. And then in non-healthcare setting, OSHA put out a non-mandatory mandate that's not mandatory, but it's suggested. Now, when the governor of Michigan decided she was going to roll back all of the executive orders on all the masking, one thing that she did was she actually said that healthcare, OSHA healthcare rule was still required here in Michigan. So it's still in force in Michigan under MyOSHA. The non-healthcare, non-mandatory guidance from OSHA is not mandated, but it's best practices and it's in your best interest to try to follow it. A lot of this stuff is pretty simple, pretty easy, pretty good for everybody. So Kim, if you can go to the next slide. So what you look at here is the guidance on mitigating and preventing the COVID-19 in the workplace guidance from OSHA. And if you go to the next slide, that's the one I think we need to focus on. I'm not going to go through all these details because it's a pretty long process, but I think it's important. They updated so that, recommendations, even for fully vaccinated people, right? They said, look, everybody wear a mask, choose to wear a mask regardless of level of transmission, and get tested 3 to 5 days following an exposure, right? These are things OSHA is saying you should do. These are, recommendations for everybody and every employer that you could implement. Not that you have to, but you could to keep a safer, cleaner environment. Kim, you can go to the next slide, please. So they suggest that you require unvaccinated customers and visitors also wear a mask when they're in there, and also, put a posting up. So it's important for you to talk about masking. Right now, most places have gotten rid of masking requirements. It's not something that's required. It's just something they look at. Another thing that they're looking at doing, and Kim, if you can go to the next slide, is, they're asking you to just use some common sense when you're looking at this stuff and say, look, maintain your ventilation systems like we talked about. Make sure everything's, up to code. And if you can go to the next slide, Kim. Get your routine cleaning that we talked about. Routine cleaning will go a long way. It keeps everybody safe like we talked about. And if you go to the next slide, they've actually got some guidance. I'm sure you've all seen that. In all workplaces with heightened risk where you have more people. All right, do some things like staggering your break times, stagger your workers' arrival, provide visual cues, okay? In a retail setting, they want you to ask customers and visitors to wear the mask like we talked about. Move electronic payment terminals so that it's farther away from people. Just kind of common sense stuff to keep the touch points away from each other so that you're not handling things. Adjust stocking activities, limit contact, right? Just small things that you can do. And then you go to the next slide, Kim. You'll see they're asking about other things. record and report the COVID-19 infections and deaths under OSHA. Now, this is important. There are some requirements under OSHA still. If you believe that something is a work-related injury, then you're going to have to report those. So not everybody, if somebody gets COVID from outside of work, you don't have to report everyone. But if you believe that it's met, and there's certain fields and industries where if you're a first responder, that it's deemed to be for some purposes to be work-related. But again, OSHA is just saying, hey, if you believe it's work-related, then you need and you have an obligation to go ahead and report. All right, so if you can go to the next slide, Kim. All right, so what they also want you to do is help get people vaccinated. So you should give them time off, not required, right? And remember, we used to have the paid time off, but that's expired now. Now you can voluntarily agree to give people time off in addition to their PTO, or you can use their PTO, vacation, sick time to get it. They're not mandating it, but they're encouraging you to do these things. Okay, if you go to the next slide. And again, instruct workers who are infected, unvaccinated workers who have had close contact, to go get tested and stay home. All right, again, stuff that we were doing before, but now they're just saying, hey, let's just keep it up, right? It was working, so let's just keep doing it. All right, and next slide, please. They also want you to provide workers with face covering, surgical mask, all that stuff that we've done before. And again, just keep people, really safe with the masking. And I think that's what they really want you to do, is just, again, separate and give masks. And another thing that OSHA says in their guidance is, if you can go to the next slide, Kim, is keep educating people, keep training people. They want you to keep about this, in contractors, if you have contract. Social distancing. Right now, it's one of the things that you'll see in most workplaces. It's just not happening. People are just not staying the same distance as they were before, because they don't have to, right? Everybody's vaccinated, or most people are vaccinated or chose to get vaccinated. So we're going right back to where we were before. OSHA is saying, just be careful. You can still get infected. You can still transmit it, even if you do have the vaccination. So let's just keep doing it. You just want to make sure you're doing that, okay? And tell people how it's spread. And next slide, please. And then they say, look, we want to, again, stagger those work breaks. Just like we talked about before with those guidance. So in the end, what OSHA is trying to do is keep you safe by saying, don't relax your guard. It's not mandatory, but it is something that if you get an outbreak, or you have a problem, or somebody, gets it, that OSHA could come in, or my OSHA could come in and do an inspection and say, why aren't you doing these things? Most of you still have policies about pandemic policies and COVID policies. You may have relaxed some, or you may still have it as it was before. If you have a policy and you have relaxed some of the requirements, then what you need to do is you need to make sure it's reflected in your policy. But if you have a policy and you want to keep people safe and clean, just do these simple things, and you can make everybody wear a mask. You can still require that in a workplace. A lot of places are doing it because they're like, we don't need it, cumbersome. But again, you can make rules that allow that to happen, and you probably should review whether or not it makes sense to continue to do that, because we're still getting over 2,000 cases a day in the state of Michigan, and not everybody is unvaccinated. As we saw, General Powell just died yesterday, fully vaccinated. Of course, he had an underlying health condition of cancer treatment, but this stuff is still real, and it's still hitting every day. So just some small things to think about. Mandatory vaccinations, keep your pace clean, make sure you're getting the records, make sure you can maintain your manpower, your workforce power, your employees if you need to, because the bottom line is, if you're required to get a vaccine and you're flat-footed and you have 30% of your workforce walk out or have to be fired, you're going to have a problem that's even bigger with the recruiting issues that you've got. So these are just small approaches that are going to continue through 2022, because we don't really see a change coming.